Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. Today I'm going to be talking about a very old, very powerful magical text known as the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, otherwise known as simply the Book of Abramelin. This is a book which purportedly allows its user to get in touch with a powerful higher angelic being, personal to that particular individual, called the Holy Guardian Angel, who can bring on great wisdom and great blessings to the person who successfully calls them forth. Let's get straight to it. So I talked a little bit about the Book of Abramelin in my previous video. It dates back, so far as we know, to the 1600s at the very latest, but it purports to be written by an individual who's said to have lived in the 1300s, 1400s, around that period. And that individual is a man called Abraham of Worms, a Jewish Kabbalist who traveled to Egypt and is said to have met a powerful Egyptian magician known as Abramelin the Mage. And Abramelin the Mage taught him a system of high magic, which was unparalleled compared to all the other magical practices that were being taught in the Western world at that time. Abraham of Worms makes a note of this sacred magic of Abramelin, and the Book of Abramelin is basically Abraham recounting this system of magic to his son Lamech. So the central feature of the Book of Abramelin is this operation to achieve knowledge and conversation with one's holy guardian angel. And this became one of the central rituals in the magical system of the Golden Dawn, that is the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, later on in the late 19th, early 20th century. And from there it has kind of permeated the rest of the Western esoteric tradition. So what the Abramelin operation is it's an 18-month ritual. Some translations of the text have a lot of mistakes in them, say it's 6 months. The latest scholarship says it's 18 months. And you do this ritual for 18 months in relative seclusion, and then at the end of that, this being called the Holy Guardian Angel appears, which is like a personal angel who can help you to understand your true self and can also help you to understand your identity with divinity by merging with you in some sense, in some kind of mystical participation or ecstatic union. And if you want to know more about the Holy Guardian Angel, because it's quite a mysterious concept, go watch my previous video. I'll link the video in the description below. But there's a lot of really specific things that you need to do and ways that you need to prepare in order to carry out this extensive 18-month operation. So in terms of the preparation for the Abramelin working, you need to be honourable and pious. You need to have a religious fervour and also conduct yourself in a very moral fashion with a lot of integrity. You need to be in good health. You need to be in a situation where if you can't withdraw from society completely, then at the very least you need to minimize the time you spend in social groups as a member of clubs or associations or organizations. You need to minimize the amount of time where you are engaging in activity that is of the world. You need to not have any kind of intimacy with a close partner unless it is for the express purpose of conceiving children, and it is in the specific bed that is in the house where you are conducting the operation. In the final 6 months of the operation, you have to live off just water and vegetables, and you're supposed to be between the ages of 25 and 50. No older, no younger when you conduct the operation. But you need to have a very specific location set aside for undertaking this working. If you can't get away to a place in the wilderness, you need to find a house that has very specific features, such as a square room, which can act as a prayer room, and this is a room which needs to have 2 windows, one facing to the east and one facing to the west. And in the center of the room, there is an altar. And it also needs to have some sort of an area surrounding it, which is close to, but not part of the prayer room, where spirits can be summoned and communed with at a safe distance. And whatever place you select for the working, you need to finish the working in the same place where you started the working. And the assumption is that you spend all your time there. You'll basically be living there for 18 months, cloistered away, trying to contact the Holy Guardian Angel. And other people can bring you food and things like that, but you're really stuck in this location for that time, and you're really minimizing any other kind of social interaction that you have. So that's quite an onerous list of preconditions, and extremely hard to actually meet those in the modern era, and particularly for anyone who doesn't have enough time and money and resources to be able to put aside that long of a period to dedicate to a work such as this. So it's not surprising that people have come along later and tried to create a simpler, more accessible operation for contacting the Holy Guardian Angel. And then in addition to this very high standard of behavior and very high kind of bar that is set in terms of the location that you need to set aside for the working and the time that you need to set aside, there's some more familiar aspects of the ritual, things like robes, magical tools, and so forth. So you'll have 2 robes for the working, one of pure linen, which has never been washed, and another robe which is of silk and is rose or white or yellow coloured. You'll have a gold headband with the highest names of God inscribed somewhere on it. The way that it's described is like a gold bit of fabric with a piece of metal where those names are inscribed somewhere on the band. And you need a wand that is an offcut from an almond tree. The other very specific thing that you need for the Abramelin operation is a certain type of oil and a certain type of incense. So I spoke a bit about the holy anointing oil in my previous video on the Holy Guardian Angel. Although there have been mistakes in the transcription of the text in later editions, by looking at the earliest printed German manuscript of the Book of Abramelin, it's fairly clear that the intended recipe for the holy anointing oil had identical ingredients to those found in the Book of Exodus, more specifically Exodus 30 verses 22 to 25. And those ingredients are myrrh, cinnamon, fragrant cane, cassia, and olive oil to fix the mixture. Now there's a bit of a mysterious ingredient here in the form of fragrant cane, or canebossum in the original Hebrew. There's a lot of speculation as to what this ingredient is, but the consensus among scholars is that it is calamus, otherwise known as sweet flag, a kind of aromatic reed. And the earliest German printed edition of the Book of Abramelin includes calamus as one of the ingredients. In the later editions, particularly the ones that Samuel Mathers promoted in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the ingredient calamus has been substituted for galangal, a kind of root that is mainly found in Southeast Asia. Not as convincing. Some people have tried to suggest that canebossum is the cannabis plant. I think that that is just wishful thinking on the part of a culture which seems obsessed with certain types of substances and wants to redact history to reflect its own obsessions. I agree with the scholarship. I think that calamus is the most likely ingredient for the oil. A word of warning though, if you do procure the original recipe for the holy anointing oil to use for ritual purposes, as I myself have done, be wary that calamus can be quite bad for you, so just use it in small doses, do not ingest it, and make sure you wash your hands after you use it. So that's the holy anointing oil. It seems pretty clear to me that the intention of the author of the Book of Abramelin was that the holy anointing oil in the Abramelin operation should be identical to the holy anointing oil specified in the Book of Exodus, particularly given the Judaic roots of much of the Abramelin ritual. And then, of course, there is the holy incense that gets used in the ritual chamber, where once it's set up, you'll be doing all of your prayers to the angel for 18 months. The ingredients used in the holy incense of the Abramelin operation are described as balm, gummy galbanum, and storax. Now, this recipe for incense is very similar to another recipe for incense that is given in the Book of Exodus, chapter 30, verse 34, which is supposed to be the incense that God prescribes for use, first of all, when the Israelites are in the desert, before they reach the Promised Land, for use in the tabernacle and the tent of the tabernacle, and then later when the temple is built, for use in the temple. And the recipe for this incense is stacte, galbanum, onycha, and frankincense. Now, galbanum, it's clear, has been repeated twice in both recipes. But what are we to make of stacte and onycha? Well, stacte is thought by some people to refer to myrrh, so it would be the same as the balm that is described in the Book of Abramelin. And onycha, there is a minority view that it is in fact referring to storax. And you'll remember that one of the ingredients, besides balm and galbanum in the Abramelin incense, is storax. Now, there's a glaring omission here, and that is the frankincense. Frankincense appears in the incense in the Book of Exodus, but not in the Book of Abramelin. I find this very unusual, given the accuracy with which the oil reflected the oil in the Book of Exodus. One would have expected the same for the recipe for the incense, particularly given the magician will already need to procure frankincense to prepare the oil. I suspect, I cannot prove this, but my suspicion is that the recipe for the incense in the Book of Abramelin was meant to be the same as in Exodus 30:34, but somewhere along the line there was a mistranslation, or information got omitted and frankincense was simply left out of the recipe for the incense. So everything is set up for the Abramelin operation. You've morally prepared yourself. You have a space set aside. You have the altar. You've anointed yourself and the rest of your sacred space with the holy anointing oil. You're burning the incense. You're making your prayers to the angel, to Adonai. You continue on for 18 months, and then on what's called the day of consecration, you make contact with the angel and you have a spiritual experience with the angel. That is the working to attain knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel. But that's not the only thing that the Book of Abramelin describes, because once you have achieved that knowledge and conversation with the angel, there is then an extra 3 days at the end of that for the convocation of the good spirits, as it is called, where you're in communion with angelic beings, with a heavenly presence. And then following that, there is another operation, which is the calling forth of more malevolent spirits, not to engage in demonolatry. There are some people who work with demons today who are Satanists, who just want to be the demon's pal. This is not what's going on in the Book of Abramelin. The magician, upon being strengthened spiritually by communion with their angel, is now using their newfound spiritual authority to make all of the nastiest demons that can be conjured subservient to their will, so that they have nothing to fear from the forces of darkness anymore. And this is a very Judeo-Christian way of looking at the demonic realm, but really what it represents, it's a metaphor for gaining control of our own inner demons and not letting them run amok anymore in our own consciousness, in our own psyche. So on day one of this operation, the magician calls forth the 4 princes of evil, each in turn, and they appear. And they test the magician with all kinds of temptations and trickery and cunning. And if the magician can withstand their temptations, they pass the test of day one. And then the demon swears to be obedient to the magician. On day 2, it's much the same as day 1, except now the magician summons the 8 sub-princes of evil, who are directly beneath the 4 princes in the demonic hierarchy. And then finally, on day 3, the magician summons the next level down of spirits, which is the servient spirits of the princes and sub-princes, as well as familiar spirits. And once again, as with the previous 2 days, they are subjected to rigorous tests by the demons and temptations. And if they succeed in withstanding those, the demons are pressed into their service in the name of the angel. You will notice here that the objective of the demons is not to destroy the magician. They appear with permission, and they are there to deliberately test the magician. So, although this is a very Christian kind of way of dealing with demonic spirits, in that it's making them obedient to the magician and very much speaking down to them, it's not a purely antagonistic relationship between the magician and the demons. The demonic forces take on much more of the role of Satan in the Book of Job, who is part of God's plan, but who has a very specific role of testing the faithful. And once you have achieved knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel, and once you have subdued the 4 princes of evil and the legions of demons beneath them, you then have the ability to use the Abramelin squares. These are a series of talismans that incorporate letter squares to achieve various outcomes. No ritual for using the Abramelin squares is ever given in the Book of Abramelin. It simply says that the angel will give you a ritual for using those squares. It gives you some pre-made squares, but you can design your own squares guided by the angel for whatever purpose you have in mind. But although you might construct the squares at some point leading up to the end of the Abramelin operation, you're not supposed to use them until after you've achieved not only knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel, but you've also subdued the 4 princes of evil. And so there's very few people that have legitimately created the Abramelin squares. That is to say, have undergone a working to achieve knowledge and conversation, have at least gone through, if not the summoning of the 4 princes of evil over 3 days, an equivalent kind of long dark night of the soul, packed into 3 days, and then after surviving that experience, then creating the Abramelin squares. I've done it, and there's only one other person alive who's a practitioner of magic who I know of who has also done it. So I've actually got a book of my Abramelin squares back from when I made them in 2013-14, and this is what they look like. I opted for using beige with a blue pen. I can't remember why I did that, but there was something I read which recommended it, and it seemed like a good idea. You'll notice as well, as you look at the Abramelin squares that I've prepared, it's written in Enochian script. So that's not prescribed in the Book of Abramelin, The reason why I did it is because Crowley did it, to give them extra power, given that Enochian is a very powerful magical language. And the reason why we know that's what Crowley's Abramelin squares looked like is because Grady McMurtry visited him and actually found Crowley's squares in a book much like this, pasted, and tried to peruse the book and flick through it, and was immediately reprimanded by Crowley, who said, "Don't touch that. It's far too dangerous." So because of that story, we know that there is a precedent for writing the letters of the squares in Enochian script. So that's what I did. And even though there's no ritual as such for using the Abramelin squares, there are certain specifications for what to do with certain squares depending on what they're being used for. Now, there's a bit of disagreement about what the Abramelin squares should contain. Once again, it comes down to bad translations of the text. One of the more modern versions of the Abramelin text is this translation here by Samuel Mathers from Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn fame. I picked this up in a second-hand bookshop. It's a edition printed in 1975, first printed in 1975. Very difficult to find in a bookshop today. But that was what I was working from for the most part, until I realized that this is not the best translation. There's another version in more recent times of the Book of Abramelin that has been published by Den and Guth, which goes back to the earlier, more accurate German manuscript that I was discussing before, and it does this with the squares as well. So it gives more complete versions of the Abramelin squares, but there's still information missing in certain parts of certain squares. But another modern esotericist who has looked into the Abramelin squares is Aaron Leach. He has done his own version of the Abramelin squares, which are more complete, and he's actually looked at what the Hebrew terms being used in various squares are, and so using that kind of deduction, he's filled in some of the gaps in some of the squares, and then he's been guided by his intuition to fill in the rest. So when I crafted my Abramelin squares, I kind of used a combination of Den and Guth's squares and Aaron Leach's squares, and I judged it on a case-by-case basis. I think in some instances there's a good justification for Aaron Leach changing the squares, but if he's just going off an intuition, that's not always reliable. So sometimes I actually vied to go for the Den and Guth version of the squares. But those are the two sources that I would recommend if you're looking into how you should prepare the Abramelin squares. And just generally, I think that Den and Guth's edition of the Book of Abramelin is by far the best one that's out there today. In terms of little details as well, like the duration of the working, the oil recipe and so forth. It's much more accurate than the Mathers version. And by the by, Aaron Leach's work on Enochian magic is just exceptional. So what about the operation in the Book of Abramelin, the central operation to achieve knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel? Has anybody actually attempted this? Well, there was one person known to history who tried it, and that was Aleister Crowley. He presumably tried the 6-month version because he only had access to the Mathers version of the text. But he purchased a house called Boleskine House, and he turned that into his magical headquarters. And from this house, he conducted the Abramelin operation. However, he cut it off halfway through because he received a letter from Mathers, who was in the Golden Dawn with Crowley, about an ensuing civil war between Mathers and some of the other Order's members about who should control the Golden Dawn. And Crowley sort of got swept up in all of that and left the working aside. And in my opinion, this was actually a big mistake of Crowley's. It was a pretty obvious test that he was being given, and he chose bickering and worldliness over staying focused on the operation and on the work. So that's unfortunate. And something does seem to have gone awry with the Abramelin operation as he performed it, because there were all sorts of phenomena in Boleskine House after that point. There were shadowy figures that were walking through the halls, other people who lived in the house, awful things happened to after the fact. So it kind of became cursed after that. And in fact, in recent years, Boleskine House actually burnt down. You know, you don't mess around with this level of magic. You need to be very responsible, and don't make silly mistakes, and don't take it for granted, because you're dealing with forces that are immensely powerful and immensely dangerous if they're misused or abused. And the other thing that has sort of popularized the Abramelin operation in more recent times is a film called A Dark Song, which is based on the Abramelin operation, although admittedly it doesn't reflect the details of the working as I've set them out in this video, and it's a much darker take on the ritual for an audience that likes horror and suspense and all of that sort of thing, and supernatural thrillers and all of that sort of thing. But is there any point in doing the Abramelin operation in today's day and age? I would say, I mean, if you really want to, sure. You know, if you've got 18 months where you don't have to work, you've got no rent to pay or no mortgage to pay, and you've got other people who can keep you alive, and you've got plenty of resources to spare to buy a house with very specific details in its different rooms that you can purchase for the sole purpose of doing a magical operation, sure, you could do it. But you have to live the life practically of a saint by modern standards in order to be successful. But if that's a bridge too far for you, there's other methods that you can use to contact the Holy Guardian Angel. And they're more modern. I discussed them in my previous video, which I'm plugging yet again, on knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel. And I'm going to do a subsequent video on the working to achieve knowledge and conversation that I myself engaged in 2013, to give you some sort of an idea of what it actually looks like to go through this kind of an operation to contact the Holy Guardian Angel. So stay tuned for that. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like it if you did, and subscribe to my channel to support what I'm doing. Leave your comments down below if you have any. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.